Our reading this morning comes from Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 42. Mark 14, verses 32 to 42. Very familiar passage from Mark's gospel, which reads as follows. And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." Going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." May the Lord bless us as we live in his word together. Sometime back, I shared a story that Max Lucado tells about an avid fisherman who always came back from his fishing trips with a boat full of fish. Now, I know people like that. I am not one of them. Historically, I find it much easier to catch a cold than a fish. But this guy had a knack for always landing the big fish. One of his best friends happened to be a game warden who always asked him to divulge his secret. Where was this honey hole spot on the lake that always enabled him to find this consistent supply of big fish? And how did he always get them to bite? What lures did he use? Was it live bait? What was his secret? His buddy, the game warden, would ask again and again, and each time the man would say, I don't fish and tell. Time and again, at the end of the day, he'd come back to shore with a boat full of fish. And finally, his buddy, the game warden, wore him down, and he invited him to go out the next morning. And so they left just before the crack of dawn, and they found this secluded spot in the lake. The game warden thought, okay, here's the spot. And he tried to remember how they got there, and then he watched as the fisherman casually opened his tackle box and reached down into the bottom of the box and pulled out a big stick of dynamite. Then very calmly lit the fuse and pitched it up in the air. And as you might imagine, the huge explosion created such a disturbance in the water that dead fish and stunned fish of all sizes began to float to the top of the lake. He then casually picked up his net, began to scoop up the fish, making it clear that he'd done this thousands of times before. The game warden watched this whole scene unfold for a few minutes, stunned, a little bit deaf from the sound of the explosion, and speechless. And finally he found the words and began to yell, "That's unethical. It's not just unethical, it's illegal. It's dangerous. You can't do that anymore. I'm going to haul your tail into jail." The fisherman never flinched. He's reached into the bottom of his tackle box, pulled out another stick of dynamite, lit it, and pitched it over in his friend's lap and said, "Are you going to flap your gums all day or are you going to fish?" I love that story. And I like to revisit it from time to time because I think it reminds us just how quickly our situations can turn and how life-altering decisions have to be made right now. One minute you're going through life, minding your own business on a fishing trip, and the next minute you're faced with a dynamite decision. There's no time to think, no time to reflect, no time to fast or call a prayer meeting or seek spiritual counsel. Life just throws a stick of dynamite in your lap, and you've got to do something with it before it blows up in your face. Got to make an important decision like that. The disciples faced that kind of decision in the garden. They had just shared a memorable meal with Jesus in the upper room, and they'd gone with him to this lovely spot in the Garden of Gethsemane where their full bellies were making it difficult for them to keep their eyes open during the prayer meeting. Maybe you're experiencing that right now if you had a big breakfast this morning. One moment they were having a nice, restful evening with Jesus, and the next they were greeted, if we kept reading in this passage, with soldiers who had torches and swords and had come to take away their master. This dynamite decision blew up in their faces, and we really can't be too hard on them because as we read this story, we can't help but imagine ourselves in it. And when we do, I think most of us can picture ourselves running around the garden like chickens without our heads cut off, just like the original disciples in the gospel tales. Just because we weren't in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus doesn't mean we don't face dynamite decisions of our own. I think of the teenage boy getting ready for practice in the locker room when his buddy says, "Hey, look at this picture I've got on my phone." The pressure's on. The dynamite's been lit and thrown in his lap, and now he's got to make a decision that's going to greatly influence the kind of man he's growing to be and how he's going to look at women in general. I think of the teenage girl who's sitting in a movie on a date with her boyfriend who leans over to her and says, "You know, if you really love me, tonight we'll take this relationship to the next level." It's as though he lit a stick of dynamite and set it in her lap, and the fuse is flickering, and she's got to do something with it that's going to impact the rest of her lives in many ways that she probably can't even comprehend in that moment. And it's not just teenagers who face those kinds of dynamite decisions that come so suddenly. I think of people who've committed to give up gossip because of its negative impact on their faith and their fellowship. And I am not going to gossip anymore, God. I've given that up. No more chisme for me. And then that juicy piece of news falls in their lap just before a friend calls and says, "Hey, what's up? What's going on with you?" What are they going to do? Will they honor their commitment or will they share just one more time? Maybe if they share and then at the end say, "You know, let's pray for them," it'll all feel better, right? Because it's much more spiritual. And we chuckle about that, but that juicy piece of gossip is sitting in their lap like a stick of dynamite with a flickering fuse. And what they choose to do with it is going to impact their ability to grow in fellowship for good or ill. I think of people who are struggling a bit financially when they are approached by a friend with a surefire way to make a quick buck through some dealings that are maybe on the gray area of ethical. This extra money would sure help, and the friend is sure no one will ever find out and no harm will come, and the dynamite's been lit, and that impactful decision has to be made. I think of the man who's struggling in his relationship with his wife when an alluring female coworker asks, "So what are you doing after work today?" And he has a pretty good idea what she has in mind, and it seems pretty appealing, really, but the dynamite's been lit, and it's tossed in his general direction, and he's got to figure out what to do with it, and the decision he makes is going to impact his family and his life, for better or worse, in profound ways. I think of the woman who's feeling a little neglected and unappreciated at home when suddenly she notices a message in her Facebook inbox from an old boyfriend, and his note is innocent enough, but the more she reads it, she realizes it ignites something inside her that she hasn't felt for a long, long time. That fuse is flickering very quickly, quicker and quicker, and she has to decide, how will she respond? Those are all difficult, impactful choices that have to be made now. And I think if we went around the room, we could think of a million other impactful, real-life scenarios that come our way and demand an immediate response that have huge, far-reaching consequences. And before we are faced with that kind of dynamite decision in the garden, Jesus invites us to implement the spiritual discipline of watchfulness, a much forgotten discipline. Many of life's crucial decisions are those that creep up on us unexpectedly. It's not like the evil one picks up his phone and he calls and he says, you know what? I'm going to tempt you today, and if you get it wrong, it's going to ruin your life. Talk to you later. Right? That's not how that happens. Not at all. Far from it. The disciples didn't experience that at all in the garden. They were full and sleepy and satisfied after a Passover celebration with Jesus, and Jesus kept calling them to this prayer meeting, and they couldn't stay awake. I read this passage, and it makes me feel like I feel when I'm sitting on the couch next to Lisa, and we're trying to watch TV, and all of a sudden I feel her elbowing me, and I realize that I've missed something, and I try to fake like I haven't, and she says, what happened right before that? And she's got me, right? I was out. And that was the disciples. Jesus kept saying, man, stay awake and pray. And he kept coming up, and I imagine Peter, no, I was awake. I was praying. My eyes were closed, and I was praying and snoring in tongues or something like that. So one moment that's restful and quiet and lovely, and all of a sudden the garden is echoing with the clanging of swords and the loud voices of their enemies. One moment everything was quiet, and the next their world was turned upside down, and they were neck deep in a crisis. It was decision time, and they didn't handle it very well. And that's the way those impactful moments come upon us. Before we have time to think, the dynamite's lit, and it's in our lap, and we've got to decide if we're going to keep talking or if we're going to fish. The only way to be prepared at all for something like that is to heed Jesus' challenge in the garden. Several times in this account, he encouraged the disciples to keep watch. Wake up, stay alert, open your eyes, pay attention to what's going on. Jesus knew that difficult tests lay ahead, and he'd warned them time and again. And here he was calling these men to be alert and keep watch, but instead they kept giving in to sleep, and they weren't ready to face the crisis when it came. So many times we follow their example instead of Jesus, and we fail to heed that timeless challenge to keep watch. Max Lucado says it's as if Jesus is again saying to us today, stay alert, keep your eyes open, focus. When you see sin coming, duck. When you anticipate an awkward encounter, turn around. When you see temptation, go the other way. Commentator Halford Luckick says that, like the disciples, we too know something of sleep in hours that called for careful watchfulness. In our secret autobiography, these are the dark pages that record our failures. Luckick says, throughout history, pressing dangers have threatened. Opportunities great but fleeting have knocked at the door. To find the disciples, to find us, to find the church asleep with heavy eyes and dulled ears. And surely in all of them, Christ was saying, could you not keep watch 1 hour? Stay awake. Watch. Be with me here. The choices that destroy lives, break up homes, and tear churches apart seldom come when we are spiritually alert. They wait until our guard is down. They catch us sleeping when we should be keeping watch. I think this passage invites us to follow that great advice from the theologian Clint Eastwood and to realize our limitations, to be aware of them, to know our weaknesses and the situations in which we are most vulnerable to stumbling, and to learn to avoid those circumstances as much as possible. Obviously, we can't avoid every kind of temptation, but we can avoid flirting with it. It's been said that we can't stop a bird from landing on our head, but we can keep it from making a nest in our hair. Students, your parents are right when they warn you about the dangers of allowing yourself to be put in compromising situations. Do you ever hear that from your parents? Right? You're nodding, raise your hand. Yeah. Don't get in compromising situations. And adults, we would do well to heed our own advice. A place where alcohol is being served and readily available is probably not the best place for a problem drinker to unwind at the end of a hard day. Guys, if you find yourself visiting websites that Christians ought not be visiting when you use your computer in private, then discipline yourself to not use your computer in private. Set parameters on your computer usage and honor them. Certain people bring out the worst in you time and again, and you find yourself gossiping or just being generally negative or promoting some kind of attitude that's unfit for a Christian when you're around them, then limit your contact with those people. Obviously, you can't eliminate all those relationships completely, but you can make your primary relationships that edify and build up and help you be better, grow in faith. The bottom line is that we need to learn to be aware of our danger zones and spiritually watchful so we can avoid being led into more temptation than we need. Whatever areas appeal to our weakness and give Satan a foothold in our lives are areas we need to work to avoid rather than promote. We need to maintain a spiritual level of alertness, practicing the wise spiritual discipline of watchfulness long before we're faced with a difficult choice so we can be as prepared as we possibly can be. Before we are faced with the dynamite decision, Jesus in the garden also invites us to implement the spiritual discipline of prayerfulness. Throughout our psalm study, we've looked at these psalms and we've called them the prayers of God's people. This hymnal of our Old Testament, this book that gives us the language for prayer that we need, but how often do we fail to utilize that language in our own lives of faith? We talk a lot about asking what would Jesus do. For a while we had WWJD bracelets and t-shirts everywhere, and our lives would be so much better if we would learn to do what Jesus would do. But one of the things that we see Jesus doing most often that we so often fail to do is slipping away from the crowd to pray. So often in the Gospels, because we come from such a busy, action-oriented culture, we just look at what Jesus is doing and what he's saying and who's he healing. And so often we fail to notice those little moments in the story where it says simply he slipped away to the mountainside to pray. Jesus slipped off from the crowd to spend time with his Father. And in Gethsemane, we see Jesus doing that again in maybe the most famous prayer meeting ever. We hear him praying some of the most heart-filled words of anguish and struggle and commitment ever uttered. Jesus' exhortation to the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane continues to challenge us today. Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. And yet, how many times do we get to the end of a day and we realize that throughout the whole day we haven't spent a significant time at all in prayer? How many weeks do we get to the end of and we prepare for worship on Sunday, and it dawns on us that this hour on Sunday mornings and maybe before mealtime is the only time at all that we've spent in prayer? How many times do we give into our weak flesh and put our willing spirits on the back burner, so much so that our spirits maybe become less and less willing, and our flesh gets stronger and stronger? We need the opposite in our lives. Through prayer, we gain spiritual strength. Through prayer, we tap into the power of God. Through prayer, we can find the resources we need for those moments when life throws a stick of dynamite in our lap and we have to react. And so often, we live our lives in a state of spiritual slumber that leaves us ill-prepared for the troubles that come our way. If we want to prepare for the kinds of dynamite decisions that come our way, we must continually tap into the refreshing power of God through prayer. We must live lives that are defined more and more by a living daily commune with our Father in heaven. Lucado reminds us that prayer isn't so much telling God something new, but rather it's inviting God to walk the shadowy pathways of life with us, to watch ahead for falling trees and tumbling boulders, and asking God to bring up the rear, guarding our backside from the poisoned darts of the devil. Prayer is to be a continual practice of fellowship and communion with God. But so often we only get serious about prayer when we're facing some kind of crisis. If I were to poll everybody leaving the church from every service today and ask, what time in your life do you remember being most serious about prayer? I would almost guarantee that for almost everyone here, it would be, I remember being serious about prayer when I got sick, or when my family member was struggling, or when I lost my job. It would be some crisis moment of life, and that's great. We should cry out to God when the dynamite's in our lap and all we can say is, God, help me figure out what to do with this, quick. But how much stronger would we be in the midst of those circumstances if our lives of prayer were stronger leading up to those moments? Lisa and I have commented a lot to each other about how we have gotten really serious about prayer during those moments when we felt some calling to some transition in ministry, when we were living in Dublin and loving the people we were serving there, and we felt called to move south and to move to Cotulla. Man, we got serious about prayer. What was going to happen to our church? Who would lead when we were gone? What were we going to do in this new setting? How would our kids adjust? That was a serious time of prayer. And then when we were in Cotulla and feeling called to come here, especially when we looked out and Eddie Chris and Ruben Garza and Roy Davis were there all in their matching Pastor Church Committee shirts in the back of the room. It was inadvertent, but they were all wearing their matching church committee uniform. What were we going to do? Morgan was in school at that time. How was she going to adjust to the new school? And how are we going to meet new people and adjust to new crises? And those were serious times of prayer. And as we look back on those moments, each time we think about how sweet those times were and how much closer we got to each other and how God drew us near to his heart as we sought his will for our life and our family and our church. But we're also convicted at how much more we need to pray when things aren't so unsettled and so troubling and so hard. Believe me, if I'm being honest, like the disciples in the garden, Christ often has to kind of shake me and wake me up from my spiritual slumber to invite me to be more prayerful and more watchful. And maybe this passage in Gethsemane for us is that opportunity for Christ to shake us a little bit so that we can awake from our spiritual slumber and participate in this life of faith that he's called us to live. N.T. Wright says that Gethsemane invites us to stop and ponder once more where we ourselves belong. I mentioned earlier that you can't help but see yourself in this story. It's like looking into a mirror more than it is reading a story in the Bible. Wright says that we have to ask ourselves, are we like the disciples, full of bluster one minute, sleep the next, and confused shame the next? Are we ready to betray Jesus if it suits our other plans or if he fails to live up to our expectations? Or are we prepared to keep watch with him in the garden, sharing his anguished prayer? The church is called to live in the middle of this great scene, surrounded by confusion, false loyalty, direct attack, and traitors' kisses. And those who name the name of Christ must stay in the garden with him until the Father's will is done. Are we ready to do that? Are we ready to sign on today to say, Jesus, I will stay here and I will watch and I will pray until you guide me to whatever it is the Father has for me? In the garden with the disciples, we hear this calling to wake up from slumber and to watch and pray so that we might be better prepared for carrying out the Father's will. The disciplines Jesus gave us for dealing with the dynamite decisions of life are best implemented far before the dynamite is lit and tossed into our lap. Jesus showed us what to do. He watched and he prayed, and he was ready to face his opponents when they came. It wasn't his will to do those things, but he was ready to do the Father's will because he was there and he was watching and he was praying. And the other side of that coin is right there before us as well. The disciples were there sleeping, failing to watch and pray. And so when push came to shove, they ran like scared mice. They weren't prepared for that stick of dynamite that was thrown in their lap. And the question today is, are we preparing for the next unexpected crisis by staying in the garden with Jesus, seeking the Father's will? Are we living a life of spiritual watchfulness or spiritual slumber? Are we living lives of prayer or prayerlessness. Instead of waiting for a crisis to get serious about the spiritual disciplines and to submit to God's will, today we have this opportunity to decide to live with spiritual alertness every day. We need to heed Jesus' call to be watchful and prayerful, to practice these disciplines daily so that when life throws that stick of dynamite in our lap, we are as prepared as we possibly can be for it. As we face the coming week, let us do so hearing Jesus' challenge from the garden, that we might keep watching and praying, that we may not come into temptation. And all of God's people said, amen. This morning, we're going to sing a song of invitation together. And as we prepare to do that, I want to extend an invitation to everyone here.